This lecture will conclude our series on ancient art by turning to the last great emperor, Constantine, who would legalize Christianity and is remembered as such, memorialized throughout Europe. The late empire is going to last from Septimius Severus to the death of Constantine in Constantinople in 337. It is at this time that we find the tetrarchy begins to disintegrate. When Diocletian retires in 305, there is 20 years of civil war. Out of this civil war with Constantius Chlorus is his son Constantine, who is going to be ruling from Trier, and battle after battle is going to conquer Maxentius, then Licinius, until he's going to rule all of the Roman Empire again, leaving it to one emperor. So when Constantius Chlorus is killed in Britain in 306, a year after Diocletian retires, we know that his troops hail his son Constantine emperor. Constantine becomes known as Constantine the Great and would rule from 306 to 337 as Caesar of the West at first, ruling the northwestern provinces from Germany. Maximian's son Maxentius would take control of Rome in the interim. It would be Constantine who would invade Italy in 312, engaging Maxentius at Milvian Bridge in Verona, where Maxentius would drown. As is the case in history and is accepted in the Christian tradition, we find that Constantine attributes his victory to the Christian God, saying that he saw a sign of the cross in the clouds with a light, hearing the words, "In hoc signo vinces," or "In this sign you will conquer." In 313, Constantine and Licinius, the last two of the emperors, this Augustus of the East, issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity. A few years later, in 324, they became foes, and Constantine had Licinius executed near Byzantium. Now Constantine, at this point in 324, is the ruler of the whole empire. He would continue at the outset the tetrarchic models and traditions, and name Maxentius as Augustus initially. The frontal head, as seen here in the portrait of Maxentius, is rare, but consistent with a late antique preference for looking directly out at the viewer, as we will see in examples of Constantine's own commissions. We find here the figure is indistinguishable from the other tetrarchs with a generic set of features, the standard tetrarchic hair which is incised regularly, with a beard and large staring eyes. The early portraits of Constantine are also tetrarchic. In his early 20s, he would be shown looking much older, thus conforming to the model of the bearded emperor. Seen in a profile view, we find the tetrarchic look at this time was synonymous with emperor and the idea of an emperor. Therefore, what Constantine actually looked like would be irrelevant, because this communicates who he is by way of the name on the coin, and merely the idea of how an emperor should appear in iconographic conventions. Now, once we start moving towards legalizing Christianity, here we have a coin that's going to be minted in 315, we start seeing a change, a shift away from tetrarchic portraiture. Here, after the defeat of Maxentius, we have a radically different understanding of who he is. Thus, he is self-consciously departing from sharing power in these earlier images of emperors who shared power. Here he's clean-shaven. He looks about 30, which is appropriate for this time. He would be rejecting the mature tetrarchic mask by adopting this clean-shaven look of eternal youthfulness, much like that of Augustus. So henceforth, all of his portraits will look youthful like Augustus, regardless of the time period until his death in 337. The dual role seen here of Imperator, as he's going to be dressed as a general with armor, a helmet, a shield with Romulus and Remus on it, off to the right. He's shown as a soldier in the army of Christ as well, for we have the Christogram in his helmet. So we find here on the shield, you have the she-wolf and Romulus and Remus. Above, on his helmet, you have Ki Roiota, which is written in the Greek XPI. So it's a Christogram time for the initials of Christ's name in Greek. Now this portrait is going to be begun the same year, 315, and is a massive monumental portrait of Constantine, 8.5 feet tall, which was recut from an earlier work, which will be common in Constantinian work, where they reuse older materials. Turning to Constantine's own portrait for his own basilica, which was not a religious structure, we have the monumental remnants of his own approach and take on tetrarchic portraiture. Originally, this image would have been seen as a monumental seated statue of Constantine in the guise of Jupiter, and in fact it's modeled after Jupiter, as in his left hand he would have held the orb, much like Marcus Aurelius in his equestrian monument. The whole of the statue would not have been expensive marble or gold, but instead it would have been a brick core with a wooden torso covered with bronze and head and limbs made of marble. Much like what we talked about with the statue of Athena in the Parthenon. It also is a wood and brick core with ivory and gold on the exterior. The nervousness that we saw earlier in the soldier emperors is now gone, supplanted and replaced by this frontal mask we often find with tetrarchic portraiture. These enormous eyes, the broad and simple planes of the head, do not communicate what Constantine looked like. Instead, it communicates the permanence that is going to be suggested by his imperial presence, the power that he holds in his hand as he's literally holding the globe. We, of course, dare not try to assassinate him or attack him, for he is God-like, showing himself like Jupiter here. Now, the idea of something being iconic versus idealized can be illustrated thusly. Here we have the rather anti-naturalistic or iconic features of Constantine, whose eyes are much too large. His brow, his, once again, head is too narrow, too flat. And then we find that his other proportions also are not going to be idealized. The portrait of Augustus shows us the same basic features, proportions, and ratios of a human head and skull. We just remove any of the imperfections that would have existed. He is a perfected version of himself here. The hairstyle of Constantine is going to be deliberate, for it is the coif taken from Trajan with this combed forward, wavy look, thus relating him to an early good emperor. We find as well the cleft chin that he is often shown with is also going to bring together the portrait of Augustus with that of Trajan. So this connection is intentional, wishing to disassociate himself from the tetrarchy and instead with the rulers from the early and the high empire, showing himself as independent unlike his direct predecessors. He would also emulate Augustus and Trajan through his building projects, with his palace in Trier, this basilica in Rome, a triumphal arch, and baths. The churches he would also commission in Rome and the Holy Land we will look at in medieval art. At the end of his life, he would found a new capital that he would also call Constantinople. Now, right next to the Colosseum in Rome, he would erect an arch to commemorate his defeat of Maxentius at Milvian Bridge. Empire. He erects an arch right next to the Colosseum and in between that and the Forum, right at the heart and the crossroads of Rome, so everyone would see this new tripartite arch, which is larger than any we've discussed thus far. As Marlowe argues, this would connect the arch to the favor he wished to receive from the sun god. Like Augustus and Hadrian before him with the Areopagus Augusti and the Pantheon, the connections to Apollo and Helios are going to be made evident in how they are like the emperor. So, as is very important to remember, Constantine is not going to abandon his religion and uses the Roman gods for his advantage. In the Colosseum Valley, which is going to be heavily traveled, this new arch would frame the colossal statue of the sun god Helios that Nero erected. Now, like earlier emperors, he would even have his likeness altered to show the regime change with his head on this god that was then framed by the arch. Marlowe also argues this connects again Constantine to Augustus and Nero, who associated themselves with the sun god, the cult of the sun, which is often shown as Sol with a rayed crown on the raised right hand. So Constantine even showed himself as the god of the sun. Much like, of course, the spiked helmet indicating the radiating rays of the sun are going to be seen today in the Statue of Liberty. So this is, interestingly, the first monument that is going to be built to commemorate victory over another Roman. In the inscription at the top, it is going to state that he defeated the tyrant Maxentius and thanks this divinity, who remains unnamed, for this victory. This is the first monument that is going to be erected that celebrates a victory of a Roman over another Roman. And because much of downtown Rome is still occupied by the pagans that worship the polytheistic Roman religion, Constantine is going to do a nod of the hat to Christianity, but cannot publicly embrace it as of yet. Testifying to the state in ancient Rome and the lack of resources, every block of this arch was reused from earlier buildings, monuments, and even other triumphal arches. It is spolia. We are reusing material for a new appropriated reason and context. Now, he did not just select any monuments, nor is he going to associate himself with just any emperor. In fact, if you look at those that he selected, taking from Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, as seen in the Arch of Constantine, his artisans would recut the heads and add labels to reference Constantine instead of the monuments they were taken from, reusing sections that would relate him to the good emperors. The Aurelian reliefs are also going to be seen next to the captured Dacians like Trajan. So do we see here, in fact, the decline of creativity and technical skill, or an interest in a new direction that does not emphasize classical clarity, as seen here, where a new head would be added to an existing classical address by an emperor? Each one of these are known as good emperors, so he wants to associate himself with these earlier good emperors. So when he selects an image and does not change it at all, like the largesse of Marcus Aurelius, we are seeing that he's going to be associating himself with the giving of alms to the poor as earlier great emperors had, like the philosopher emperor Marcus Aurelius. Here we have a standard classical example of a relief with differentiated people, individuals down here, a mature man, a young woman, a child. All are going to be below, stair-stepping upward and back into space, where Marcus Aurelius and his entourage are, dropping money down to those individuals below. Turning to the same scene that Constantine's artists will carve for him, we have a very different style. This style is known as the late antique style, which is, by definition, very iconic and anti-naturalistic. It does not attempt to show us what these individuals looked like, nor to show individuals at all. Instead, here we have the same division between people below receiving money from the emperor and his retinue, his entourage above. But now all of the figures are the same. In a cookie-cutter-like fashion, they have the same facial hair, the same expression and dress. Therefore, we are not trying to show a group of individuals. This is a crowd communicating the idea that is the essence here. That is, Constantine is forever going to be magnanimous and charitable. Not showing what it would have looked like, but the idea behind it is paramount. This new set of values, which is a rigid formality and an iconic presentation, will supplant the classical notion of the picture window, thus paving the way for iconic art of the Middle Ages and Christian art. Before arriving in Rome, Maxentius had already begun a new basilica. Constantine merely completes it and installs that massive portrait we looked at in the Western Apse. This is going to be the location and the original intended appearance of the emperor as Jupiter. This statue would have sat monumentally in the apse of his Basilica Nova, or the Basilica of Constantine, which was 300 feet long and 215 feet wide, and whose dimensions would be the model for the first Christian cathedral we will discuss after coming back from the exam. Here, aside from the Baths of Diocletian, we have the largest building in the capital in a century and the first basilica completed in the city since that of Trajan as part of the Forum of Trajan. The structure is a brick-faced concrete walls with 20-foot thick sections like the Pantheon, supporting a coffered barrel vault that buttress the vaults of the nave that are 115 feet high. Originally, we would have seen marbled and stuccoed revetment, making the interior look much more expensive, concealing the fact that it is primarily brick and concrete. The Baths of Caracalla would have been the direct precedent and would have been the model for the architects working for Constantine to have as a touchstone. The plans are in fact based on those of the Baths of Caracalla, and we can see in the surviving 3 side chapels or barrel vaulted sections that are coffered that they are in fact modeled on those massive barrel vaults that we find in the Baths of Caracalla. In fact, his architects would combine the shapes of the Basilica Ulpia of Trajan with the groin vaulting of the Baths of Caracalla, thus bringing together these two different shapes and designs. Here we have the interior space of this earlier basilica by Trajan, an emperor he would have wanted to associate himself with, and whose forum is right next to the example that we have here, the Basilica Nova. And we can see the plan for the Basilica Nova has the apse like the Basilica Ulpia and the side aisles. While the Basilica Nova does not survive intact, at Trier, the seat of imperial power of Constantius Chlorus, we do have another previous basilica that looks much like it. So Constantine built a new palace complex here with the Basilica Audience Hall that shows us what the original appearance of the previous one might have looked like. Here, the Aula Palentina, made in the early 4th century, will have these blank exterior, unadorned brick facade with a 190 feet long design, which is 90 feet wide. It's going to be 2-storied with a clear story above letting in light with Roman-shaped arches for windows. This is going to alleviate the severity of the brick exterior by adding projecting vertical buttresses so that we have additional support seen here. Here we can see them on the outsides of the structure that are the protrusions between the windows that are also supporting the weight of this brick structure. Originally, we must remember this structure would have been stuccoed like we would have seen the Basilica Nova, making it look more expensive. There were no side aisles in this example, but we did have 2 stories of large windows and a semicircular apse to let in light. This is a very pompous setting for the emperor, which would have originally had colored marble veneer, and mosaics all in the interior space. Today, obviously, it functions as a church, and these basilicas are going to be the model for early Christian churches, with the large interior space or the nave. The terminology in these basilicas also will be important for early Christianity, for we have a rectangular nave, named as such because in Latin it is nave, or a ship, so because it looked like a ship turned upside down. This is where the congregation is going to stand. We also have side aisles, which can be used for burial chapels or smaller services. We enter at the very outset through a narthex, or an atrium, and then we focus our attention on a semicircular protrusion or apse, usually elevated on a platform with a podium for someone to speak. The emperor, or the statue as in Basilica Nova in this example, would have occupied this elevated position, reflecting the position of Greco-Roman divinities who would be looming over these mortals. Thus the emperor is still associating himself with the gods. The final monument we will speak of regarding Constantine is Santa Costanza, which is going to be built in the mid-4th century as a mausoleum for Constantia, which is going to be the daughter of Constantine. Here it is the shape of early and high imperial mausolea, such as Augustus's and Hadrian's, which is circular with additional trees planted on the sides. The interior is going to be decorated with columns and is double-storied like that of Diocletian's mausoleum. It is circular with a central plan around a dome and an ambulatory or a walkway that would anticipate Byzantine churches and the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. We still have the nave in the center, the ambulatory where the side aisles would be, and the narthex, which is a foyer or the entryway. Here we walk around the exterior of this walkway, which houses in the center would have originally been the sarcophagus for Costanza. Here we can see that it has been converted to a church with an altar in the center and her purple porphyry marbled sarcophagus pushed off to the wall. The wheel-like colonnade had paired columns designed, and the original mosaics, interestingly enough, survive to this day because they feature grape harvesting and floral ornaments, which were repurposed by Christians for a new understanding of communion and the promise of new life and revival if one believed in Christ. Here we can see individuals making wine in the process of harvesting grapes, all very appropriate for the worship of Bacchus and the promise that someone would make it to Elysium and be in paradise in the underworld. The design is going to be important because with the Aula Palentina in Germany and the circular plan of the Santa Costanza, or even the Temple of Minerva here, we have the two plans for early Christian churches. In the Latin West, we would have an elongated nave with an apse, and in the Greek East, we would have circular structures or churches that would be centered around a different liturgy. Now, we know that Constantine moves his capital to Constantinople in 330 Common Era. This is precipitating the downfall and decline of Rome, for the Western Empire falls in 410 with the sack of the Visigoths, who come through Rome being led by King Alaric. This ends antiquity and will begin a new phase in history, that being the Middle Ages. So please make flashcards of the final review, look over your notes, and be prepared to watch the final exam review.